So let us look at what we term as ecological succession. So we look at this scenario. You are having a question on volcanic eruption. And in 201, okay, a volcanic eruption created a new island off the coast of Iceland. Okay, initially the island was covered with bare rock and ash. After 2 decades, that is after 20 years, scientists have observed gradual appearance of lichens, mosses, insects, and eventually grasses and shrubs. Researchers recorded changes in biomass and species richness at regular intervals. And this is the graph that they actually got. Okay, so there appears to be increasing biomass as the years progress. Okay, year 0 there was 0, and then after 25 years, biomass was 9.5 kilograms per meter squared. Richness, species richness, the number of different species is actually also increasing from 0 in year 0 to 55 after 25 years. Okay, so something is definitely happening. What is definitely happening here is that you're having an area that was not having any organism, now having organisms of different species, and therefore the biomass of these organisms is actually increasing. That's what we are having in this scenario. So can we use the graph and analyze and explain the relationship between species richness and biomass over the years? How does this reflect the changes of primary succession? And then second is, can you describe the key stages of primary succession observed in this island? And then suppose the island soil is now suitable for small tree species. Can you propose conservation-based land use plan that will maintain biodiversity without halting the natural succession? Justify your choices. Can you predict and explain the introduction of large grazers like goats and how they could disrupt the current succession? Can you suggest 2 strategies to minimize their impact or its impact if you introduced a large grazer mammal or a large grazing mammal on this island? Okay, so the points here are that we are having primary succession, and with primary succession what happens is that you're having a place or an area that has never had any living organism, but eventually this area gets colonized first by lichens, followed by mosses, and then other organisms like the shrubs, and having some later on some trees happening or coming up. That is typically what happens in an ecosystem. But of course, this process can be disrupted by human activities, for example, introduction of large mammals, and this can actually disrupt the ecosystem, okay, of this emerging ecosystem, okay? Because remember, initially there was no life, and then we have colonization, okay? And then when you have human activities, such as farming and for example, grazing, they can disrupt this succession. Okay, so let us look at this in details. So earlier on, we did note that when we are looking at ecology, we can look at it whether at population level or community level. When you're talking about a community level, we are looking at different populations occupying a particular area in any given period of time. Okay, so community ecology studies how these communities actually change over time. What are the things that make these communities change, and what interactions do we have? Okay, these communities will not always remain the same throughout. They will keep changing because of different factors, biotic and abiotic factors. So you cannot have the community remaining the same throughout. So ecological succession is when we are looking at the changes that are happening over time in communities. Okay, so it helps us to understand what happens, whether naturally or what happens when humans actually intervene over time. Okay, so these long-term investigations are very important because they reveal what happens when we have a forest emerging, or what happens when a forest is actually cleared and things like that, or what happens when we have a bare rock that has been there for years and then eventually having, let us say, lichens. What happens? What processes are actually involved? Okay, so succession uh, is very important. Okay, succession is very important. It can happen. It happens basically naturally. You have an area that has not had life before, but then you have lichens coming, mosses, ferns, and then many other plants coming. That progression is very important. But of course, that progression can still be disrupted by also natural processes. Remember, we said that human activities can disrupt the succession processes, but also things like the volcanic eruptions can actually disrupt successions. Glacier retreats, wildfires, and of course, human activities can disrupt it. So when we talk about ecological succession, we are referring to the gradual replacement of organisms in a community, progressing from simpler to more complex organisms over time. So this is basically to emphasize the fact that organisms actually, or communities do change over time. Okay, so we are illustrating this using, you can see that is bare soil, but over time you will see some plants being there. Okay, so that is basically what happens. You have some grasses, later some shrubs, later some trees. Okay, so that is what we call ecological succession, the gradual replacement of organisms in a community, progressing from simple organisms to more complex organisms over time. Or we can say ecological succession refers to the gradual, progressive, and cumulative changes in the structure of biological community over time. So, in my discussion, I've talked about lichens, mosses, and then other organisms, shrubs, and then trees. I've been consistent with that. That is because succession actually happens in an orderly manner. Okay, you cannot start with the trees and then you go to these smaller organisms, I mean plants, or even organisms. Okay, so when we talk about ecological succession, we are looking at transitioning from simpler beginning to a more complex community, which we often term as climax community. And the climax community is now very stable and complex with a number of species. We can talk about share. This is now it refers to the entire sequence of stages in the succession process, from the simpler beginning to now a complex or climax community, which is very stable, a stable community. Okay, so for example, that can be regarded as a stable community. So what are these stages of ecological succession? The stages are, you have Nudation, which is the initiation of the succession process after a major disruption. For example, after, let us say, a volcanic eruption, the initial processes that will allow colonization of this rock with the living organisms, that is called nudation. So migration is when you have these plant species coming to occupy this new area. And then excesses, establishment of these species, competition, struggle for resources, reaction. Now, species induce environmental changes. Okay, so initially the environment may not be suitable. You don't have sufficient water, sufficient nutrients, sufficient everything. But later on, when you have organisms now occupying or colonizing these areas, you have favorable conditions, more soil, more nutrients, okay, more organic matter, right? So these factors that I've talked about are actually environmental changes that are happening because of the organisms that are occupying that area. And then you have stabilization, the climax community. When you see a forest, that is the climax community. You have very many things there. It is very stable, it is rich in species, and it is self-sustaining. A lot of things are happening. Okay, so we have two types of succession. We have primary succession and secondary succession. So our scenario basically talks about primary succession. The question that we had is about primary succession. So what is primary succession? This is when you have land that has not had life before, and now you have an ecosystem that is starting to emerge. And this can happen on bare rocks, sand beaches, sandy beaches. Usually the first three organisms that come and occupy these areas are the ones we call the pioneer plants. And these ones are usually the lichens. We call them pioneer species. The lichens is actually a symbiotic relationship. You need to check that out. So what happens is that these lichens, which we term as pioneer species, we can also term them as primary colonizers. They are the ones that can come and occupy this area first. They can withstand these harsh conditions of not having sufficient soil, not having sufficient organic matter, not having all these things. Okay, so what do they do? Of course, when they land onto these areas, of course, they have to be dispersed, okay, for them to be there. Okay, you need to have seed dispersal mechanisms that will allow them to grow on such bare rocks. And when they are growing on these bare rocks, of course, you have weathering also happening, and more soil will actually be formed, and this more soil will now be available for other species, including the shrubs, small trees, and things like that. And then over time, you'll have you have tall and long-lived trees establishing and forming a climax community. So we come back to our scenario. So initially, you will have pioneers. These pioneers are not very complex, and therefore they don't have a large biomass. But what they will do is that they will help in formation of soil through weathering, and also provide more organic matter when they die, and this will result into growth of other species that have been dispersed in this area. So you will have gradual replacement of the lichens with mosses, and then as you can see in this slide, you can see this here. you have the lichens, and then mosses coming, and then you have soil being formed. This soil is now sufficient for grasses to grow. Okay, when you have these grasses, you now also have small herbaceous plants, shrubs, large herbs, and then trees now coming. We also have what we call pioneer trees, and then this will actually give us the climax community, where you have different trees with different ecosystems, different populations, and things like that. Okay, so coming back to the scenario again. So you have gradual increase in biomass because more species are colonizing, but also these species are more complex and therefore have more biomass. And that's why you have increasing biomass over the years. So the stages, the ones that we have just illustrated in the slides, and yes, when you have colonization happening, this is usually colonization or succession, starting with the lichens and then the mosses and things like that, the pioneer plants. This is a delicate stage, and that means that it's very important that you don't have disruption of this colonization or succession process. And that's why conservation mechanisms are actually important, because if these conservation mechanisms are not implemented, or you have activities that disrupt this succession, you have a number of problems. Okay, so if you introduce an animal like a grazer that will actually feed on this ecosystem that is yet to be very stable, you'll have this process actually being disrupted. Okay, so you just need to make sure that you need to have sufficient carrying capacity. Okay, that means that you have sufficient